Hi, welcome to this micro talk titled The Past, Present and Future of Autistic Gaming Accessibility. A very quick personal introduction. My name is Laura Kate Dale, and for the past 5.5 years, I've been publishing a series of weekly and written and video articles online about video game accessibility. I also work as an accessibility consultant, doing playtesting for EasyServe and working as cognitive accessibility expert for Playability. A quick personal disclaimer. While I am autistic myself, I can't speak on behalf of every autistic person. Autism is a spectrum condition, and while I will attempt to discuss in this talk aspects of accessibility that don't impact me personally, there will inevitably be parts of the autistic experience I don't capture due to this being a single perspective and a time-limited talk. There's a whole bunch more nuance that we could go into on this topic that won't fit into 15 minutes, so I'm just going to jump into talking about how video games in the past have accommodated autistic players and ways that they could accommodate autistic players in the future. So, back in September of 2020, Marvel's Avengers was published by Square Enix. While the game itself wasn't terribly notable in terms of accessibility, there was one scene I was fascinated with. In the scene, Kamala Khan is riding in a car with Bruce Banner. No dialogue is exchanged, but the scene plays out with Kamala slurping her near-empty drink cup loudly to get a rise out of Bruce, with him rolling his eyes in an annoyed response. What made the exchange fascinating to me was that the subtitle track was used during this scene to explain the non-verbal subtext of the back and forth, explaining that the slurping was deliberately intended to annoy Bruce, and that his eye movements were an exasperated response to her antagonistic actions. This scene is one of the only times I have ever seen a video game explicitly explain non-verbal mannerism subtexts as text, and it was hugely useful for my understanding of the intended interpretation of the scene. While not common currently, I'm a big believer that non-verbal mannerism subtitles and dialogue tone tags are two of the biggest areas where we could be normalizing autistic player accessibility in the games industry. Earlier this year, we did get a couple of pretty solid examples of games offering players tone tags on existing subtitles, similar to how many games offer optional speaker name tags today, to state the emotion with which certain lines of dialogue are being stated, to more clearly highlight things like sarcasm or audible uncertainty. The game I'm going to talk about in this example was Assassin's Creed Shadows, which labeled the setting emotion subtitles. In terms of the work required to design non-verbal mannerism subtitles like those seen in Marvel's Avengers, I believe that we could start by looking at the work currently being done to write cinematic audio descriptions of cutscenes for blind players. These audio descriptions often already describe visual non-verbal subtext textually, and some of that work could be used as the basis for a non-verbal mannerism subtext subtitle track. In fact, Assassin's Creed Shadows, while not including non-verbal mannerism subtitles, did describe non-verbal mannerisms in its audio descriptions for blind players. A lot of this work could be reused as the basis for a non-verbal mannerism subtitle track, which could be presented as an optional separate subtitle track above dialogue, similar to the way that Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga had a two subtitle track system so that a second subtitle track could be positioned above the dialogue. Cinematic audio descriptions already do a lot of the work of deciding how explicit or not you should be in explaining uncertain facial expressions, for example, such as describing Ellie's facial expression at the end of The Last of Us Part 1 without stating definitively whether the character believed Joel or not. This is a great example to look at as to how one might go about this type of hypothetical autistic player support. Lastly on this topic, offering tone tags could also be really useful for games with narrative dialogue choices, particularly those that noticeably branch their narratives. An effective example of this recently released was the game Atomfall by Rebellion. Let's talk about dialogue boosting. As part of a recent PlayStation 5 firmware update, players were offered the ability to change system-level audio balance. While designed primarily to help gamers with hearing loss boost frequency ranges they might find difficult to hear, I found the ability to boost the mid-range of audio, where dialogue is generally found, louder in the system-wide audio mix, to be incredibly helpful. As someone who often struggles to filter out unnecessary sensory information and focus deliberately on things like speech, Being able to system-wide boost the speech volume in dialogue mixes has done wonders for my ability to pick out dialogue in otherwise sensory cluttered scenes. Sensory dampenings or warnings. One of the ways that I'm most personally impacted by being autistic on a day by day basis is my relationship with sensory sensitivity. I often find that small noises that other people might find easy to mentally tune out are impossible for me to ignore, or that when presented with too much sensory input overlapping at once, I can become physically anxious and stressed as my brain struggles to process overlapping unfiltered input. In terms of ways that video games can help support players with sensory oversensitivity issues like myself, I want to highlight an example of a game that I recently worked on as an accessibility consultant that released last year. Life is Strange Double Exposure. That game offered players the ability to receive on screen warnings prior to loud noises and bright light flashes appearing in game, as well as the option to decide whether these warnings would pause the game automatically or simply display a warning on screen to avoid impacting the flow of the narrative. Additionally, many video games today offer players the option to reduce the dynamic range of audio, so that the loudest noises in the audio mix are more quiet and the quietest noises are slightly louder. Developers can also help reduce sensory sensitivity issues by reducing potential photosensitivity triggers in their games. This is helpful in a general sense for autistic players who are sensitive to visual overstimulation, but also useful in that photosensitive conditions such as epilepsy are commonly comorbid with autism, a topic we'll circle back to later. Lastly, you can support autistic players with sensory sensitivity by offering a multitude of audio sliders so that potential problem audio can be made less distracting, and offering settings such as tinnitus sound toggles and misophonia modes that reduce sounds that are, coincidentally, common autism sensitivity triggers. Tools for nonverbal communication. Autism as a condition is a spectrum and can have a number of different impacts on speech and language development. While some autistic people are hyperverbal, others are completely nonverbal, while others sit somewhere along that line. Using myself as an example, I have unpredictable spells where I struggle with speech, particularly when impacted by external stress. I generally don't struggle with verbal speech, but there are exceptions, times where I simply cannot grasp words no matter how hard I try. As a result of autism's connections to verbal communication difficulties, it's important to offer alternatives to verbal communication where possible in online multiplayer titles. A great example of a game with this type of support is Apex Legends, a game whose ping system does a great job of communicating complex information about where items can be found, enemy player locations, and squad commands without needing to engage in voice chat. One thing that I would love to see the video game industry explore more going forward is ways that AAC, or augmentative and alternative communication devices, could be integrated into video game voice chats directly. These devices, often tablets with apps installed, allow for verbal communication using tools such as illustrated icons. While are ways to integrate these apps with PC programs for online voice chat, I would love to see one of the major console manufacturers officially support a plugin or settings option to allow a commonly used AAC program to interface directly with in-game voice chat on their systems. Changes in routine. For many autistic individuals, a change in an established routine can be a genuine source of stress and anxiety. It might be manageable with enough warning time and ability to adapt the routine on our own terms, but unexpected change to a routine can be pretty overwhelming for many of us. A great example of the kind of change to a game that an autistic player may find difficult if surprised by would be major changes being made to the map in a game like Fortnite when a new in-game season begins. If you've been playing the game every day for weeks, always following a very similar route across the map, and that map suddenly no longer features locations you know or has huge new features, that's a change to that predictable routine that might take some time to adjust to. For developers, the best advice I can give on this front is to request that you warn players in advance that these kinds of major changes to your game are coming, and ideally when they're going to happen, with enough advance notice to adapt and be mentally prepared for the change. Inherently inaccessible genres. Some game genres are just inherently likely to contain barriers for autistic players, with a great example of this being social deduction games like Among Us. Games where players are required to communicate via voice chat, engage in deceit, and navigate complex social interactions are inherently going to be more challenging for players who struggle with communication nuance in real time. However, these kinds of games are also often more difficult for autistic players for another reason: inherent biases in how non autistic individuals perceive autistic behavior as inherently deceptive or deceitful due to its variance from a perceived norm. It's like when you hear accounts of police assuming that autistic people taken into custody are guilty because of their lack of eye contact and flat emotional tone of voice. Sometimes aspects inherent to being autistic are perceived as signs of deception in social deduction video games. While I've not seen any great examples of games managing to mechanically offer a great solution to this problem, I do think there's room for game developers and community managers to engage in conversations with their player base around this topic. If you can make your players aware that autistic people exist and might communicate in ways that differ from them and be aware of their existing biases, you can help to reduce the frequency with which someone decides to point an accusation in these kinds of games based purely on slightly awkward speech patterns. Struggling with multi-step tasks or multitasking. One aspect of living with autism that isn't often discussed in conversations around accessibility accommodations is the cognitive load experienced by autistic individuals when processing multiple step tasks or attempting to multitask information processing. Myself and many other autistic people struggle with initiating tasks without a clear understanding of the steps that are going to follow and how they will lead to an ultimately completed task. In video games, a solution might be offering players a toggle to show what all of the steps in a quest are going to be in advance of starting. In regards to multitasking, many autistic individuals struggle with processing multiple tasks at once or being expected to unexpectedly and rapidly drop one task and move to another. In terms of ways that developers can design around this, finding ways to set expectations up front about task switching can be useful. Recognize that this can be a barrier, and if your game relies on sudden and frequent task switching as a core gameplay element, make sure to warn players that's something present in the game so they can make informed choices. Exit ramps for compulsive players. Over the past few years, addictive has become an increasingly common marketing term used to imply as a positive that a game is going to be hard to put down once you start playing. While sometimes a recipe for a game that could be enjoyable, this can make certain games incredibly hard for players with obsessive or compulsion prone cognitive disabilities to walk away from. Players like myself, who are prone to obsessively collecting sets of items, trying to max out levels, or check every possible spot for collectibles, may find certain games difficult to put down. As an autistic person, this can lead me to, at times, playing a game longer than intended, causing issues in my personal life. Addiction as a negative aspect of games. One thing that I try to encourage game developers to consider in their design is exit ramps, to give compulsion prone players clean and easy places in their gameplay loop to pause and come back another day. Examples of this could include the recent release of Elden Ring Night Rain, with its less than 1 hour long roguelike runs having a clearer exit point than the base game of Elden Ring, where a player might just go one more try on a boss for multiple hours without a clear exit opportunity. Overlaps with comorbid conditions. Disabilities rarely occur in isolation, and there are a large number of cognitive and physical disabilities that occur at statistically higher than average rates in the autistic community. While these comorbid conditions and their accessibility needs aren't directly connected to the autism diagnostic criteria, their overlaps are common enough that to support the autistic community, you ideally need to keep some other communities' needs in mind. Conditions such as dyspraxia impacting spatial awareness, fine motor control, and coordination consistency are common in the autism community, meaning that motor control accessibility often helps autistic players. ADHD has a statistically high overlap with autism, meaning that considerations around players with poor memory, lack of focus, physical hyperactivity are important. Consider options such as pinning screenshots to maps in games like Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, or options to turn off button press to skip through text for players who might absentmindedly button mash and accidentally miss text. Additionally, predatory microtransaction practices are more likely to impact players with impulsivity condition overlaps. As previously mentioned, photosensitive epilepsy is fairly common in the autistic community. Designing your game to inherently remove common photosensitivity triggers is important. Autistic individuals also often suffer from a variety of stomach issues, such as IBS. The ability to pause a game at any time is particularly important given the possibility of this overlap. And lastly, a connective tissue disorder called EDS, or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, is very common in autistic individuals and can impact everything from frequency of joint dislocations to general pain and fatigue. Offering players options to avoid motion controls, reduce button mashing, and turn holds into toggles can all help at this intersection. That's a whole bunch of There's a whole bunch of additional discussion points I had to cut from this discussion to keep it down to 15 minutes. So if you're interested in discussing this further, please come find me during the break. Thank you very much.